1, 2. Yep. Ladies and gents, thanks very much indeed. And thanks a lot for coming along. Those that have managed to make all my presentations, thanks very much indeed. I do have a hardcore of supporters that have followed me. And some of them actually given up bridge and craft lessons to come along. So I'm grateful. I know you can catch me on telly later, but I'm grateful for those that have come along, because it is a bit embarrassing standing here by yourself and talking to empty chairs. This presentation today actually came out of a dinner party. And somebody said, can you actually disappear today and actually just go off the grid and disappear? And it actually set me thinking of whether that's actually possible to do. And the way I'm going to do it is look at some well-known cases. Certainly for Britain, I do apologise for people from America, Canada, Australia. You may be aware of them, and I will give you the background to them. To look at those first and actually see how and when people can disappear. In England, we sometimes refer to it as a Reggie Perrin, and that was a TV programme several decades ago, about a businessman that disappeared. And you'll hear somebody saying he's done a Reggie Perrin, he's disappeared. They actually repeated it with Martin Clunes a few years ago, another British actor. So it's talking about people wanting to disappear off the grid. When I was a young detective, I used to say to prisoners when I interviewed them, and I was releasing them on bail, if you're going to go on the run, will you go somewhere really exotic, like Rio? And usually, I worked in the north of England, they would interpret that as Skegness, which is a small East Coast holiday resort in England, and certainly doesn't compete very much with Rio. And those that decided to go south to make it a bit more exotic went to Eastbourne, where I once went in a wet February afternoon to fetch somebody back. So, as a joking aside, people go on the run because they're wanted by the police, but they go on other reasons as well, to escape arrest, to escape from custody, or it's for domestic or civil debt reasons. It's nothing to do with the police at all, but there's a number of reasons why people try and disappear off the grid. So these are some of the people that, say, some of the British audience may know I'm talking about. Ronnie Biggs, and I'll talk about him in some detail. I'll talk about all of them in some detail. Harder, any idea? John Stonehouse, he was an MP in the British Parliament. Kenneth Noye, involved in the Brink's-Mat robbery. I'll go into detail about all of them. John Darwin, Canoe Man. Some people might remember him, I'll say. And I would imagine nobody knows the one at the end. And I'll go into more detail about that case later on. That's Thomas William Hughes, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So let's talk about Ronnie Biggs. In 1963, we had in England what was claimed to be the biggest robbery of the century. It proved not to be the biggest robbery of the century due to another one I'm going to talk about. But what happened in August 1963 is a ruthless gang of 16 robbers held up a mail train in Berkshire on its way from Scotland to London. What used to have a system of rail trains, mail trains in those days, where it would start off and it would collect carriages up as it progressed south, and in it would be normal mail but also valuable packages as well. And in this particular train there were bags of £5, used £5 and brand £5 notes and £10 notes that were being taken to London for the Bank of England. In fact, there was £2.6 million worth of money. That would translate to £69 million today. And what was seen at the time, these guys that did this robbery, including Ronnie Biggs, were seen as sort of Robin Hoods. They were a vicious gang of armed robbers. They beat the train driver, they beat up people that worked for the post office that were in the carriages. It was something that happened for 125 years. These trains had travelled from Scotland down to England. And this was one where it exposed the weaknesses of the system. Minimal security, people knew about it, and the robbery took place. They had a hideaway, a farmhouse a few miles away, because they thought if they dashed off back to London, the police would have set roadblocks up and they'd got caught. Actually, they proved to be wrong. That might have been the best thing to do. But they went back to Lechlade Farm, a few miles from the scene of the robbery, for a few days while the heat disappeared, or so they thought. And that's Ronnie Biggs. Ronnie Biggs was probably one of the most incompetent of the great train robbers. He'd actually been going straight as a painter and decorator when a friend of his, who was the leader of the 16 that was going to carry out the robbery, asked him if he wanted to be involved. And he said, we're looking for a train driver, somebody that could actually take over the train where we stop it, then move it to the bridge. And what they planned to do and what they did is they carried the bags of money down that embankment and put them in vehicles. We need somebody that can move the train a short distance. And Ronnie said, well, I'm decorating somebody's house that happens to be a retired train driver. He said, well, see if he wants to earn a few pounds to do a job for us. So Ronnie said, he'll do it. So Ronnie's only job was to find a reserve train driver. The problem is he didn't ask me if he could drive that sort of train. So on the night of the robbery, when he got in the cab, he couldn't drive it. So Ronnie was sent back with the train driver to sit in one of the cars, whilst they then had to get the Jack Mills, who was the actual driver of the train, although he was injured, get him back into the driver's seat and move the train forward. Not only was he incompetent at finding a train driver, the people who were tasked with cleaning the farm up, in fact, they should have burnt it, didn't burn it. And Ronnie's fingerprints were found on a bottle of tomato ketchup. So they'd got his print. So very, very quickly, Ronnie was arrested. The judiciary in England decided they'd got to make a real example of these robbers, and they sentenced them to 30 years imprisonment. And Ronnie went away for 30 years. Well, he didn't actually, because after 15 months, he climbed over the wall of Wandsworth Prison to a waiting removal van that's parked there, and climbed down through the removal van. And using his share of the robbery, which was £147,000, which would translate today to £3.6 million. You see why you don't see me around the ship during the day, because I'm sat with a calculator working out current values of money. And he made his way initially to Paris, where he had plastic surgery. He had to get forged documents. He then made his way from Paris to Australia for Sydney, Adelaide, Melbourne. By the time he got there, he'd £7,000 left out of his £147,000. Not very much money at all. Again, doing the translation from what it'd be worth today, he had 3 million. He's now got about £100,000 left, and he's got to live under a false identity. Living under a false identity is expensive because you can't afford to be a real person. You've got to disappear off the grid. And then he got word that the police were coming to Australia to get him. So he went where I used to tell all my prisoners to go, not to Skegness. He went to Rio. And his wife and kids didn't go there. They stopped in Australia and subsequently got divorced. He met a Brazilian lady where they had a child. But he had to raise money. And the way he raised money was by appearing on records, talking about robbers. He used to do talks for tourists. I don't think he actually did them on cruise ships, but he did do talks in Rio. But very, very gradually, the money ran out. The police went out to Rio to try and get him to give up, but he wouldn't give up. He said, no, I'm not going to come back. In 1997, he was in Brazil, I should have said, because Britain hadn't got a formal extradition agreement with Brazil. So they couldn't force him back. Then in 1997, Britain had a formal agreement with Brazil, but because he'd had a child in Brazil, they allowed him to stop. A group of renegade soldiers, probably acting for a national newspaper, went out and kidnapped him. And on their way from Brazil across the Caribbean, the ship sunk, and they managed to get ashore to Barbados. And surprisingly, although it had been a British island, controlled island, there was no extradition agreement, so he got back to Brazil again. However, eventually, in 2001, probably due to money from a national newspaper, he did come back to England, and he went to prison. And he served about 8 years of his 30-year sentence. And that's Ronnie, not long before he died. He was released from prison in 2009, and he actually died. There was a very, very successful BBC series about the Great Train Robbery, and he actually died a couple of hours before the programme was shown on BBC. So it starts to show that that's the traditional on the run, the armed robber on the run. So that's Ronnie. This is slightly different. People have different views of politicians, whether they're criminals or not. I mean, certainly in the UK last year, we had all sorts of drama about politicians getting free tickets for Taylor Swift concerts, so we're not saying directly corrupt. But John Stonehouse, he came from quite a humble background. His father worked in the shipyards in Southampton. His mum was a maid. but she did quite well. She progressed and became the mayor, the Lord Mayor of Southampton. He joined the RAF, became a RAF pilot during the war, and when he came out of the RAF at the end of the war, he went to the London School of Economics where he got his degree, and his aim was to become a Member of Parliament, which he subsequently became for a constituency in Staffordshire, which is in central England. And I say, he wasn't such a bad MP. He'd got a nice family. He liked to portray the image of a very happy family man. He did quite well. He was a member of the Labour Party, and he very quickly worked his way up to be Minister of Technology, and eventually became Postmaster General. He was responsible, or the government minister responsible, when Concorde came on the scene, and he promoted Concorde. But he needed money because he was actually living beyond his means. He wanted to have businesses. He had a very, very good social life. And he was seen by the Czech government as a potential to recruit as a spy. So actually, he was a spy for the Czech government while he was an MP in England. Kept secret till a few years ago that he was actually working for the Czech government. He actually wasn't a very successful spy because he was giving them rubbish. And the handler for the Czech agents in England saying, well, that's rubbish, get something more important. And he was generally just feeding them very, very basic stuff. A lot of it they could have got by reading the newspapers, actually. So he was a spy. On the surface, he was a successful politician, but actually it's like the swan on the surface, it's all serene underneath, the legs are paddling away. And the problem was with him, when he was in power, when he was a minister, he was all right, but when the Labour Party lost power and he went into opposition, he lost his ministerial salary. And eventually, things started to go a little bit awry for our John. It wasn't helped by the fact he was also having an affair with his secretary, Sheila, and he thought, well, I've got to do something here fairly serious. What can I do? I know, I'll die. So what he planned to do was to go to Miami on a business trip. He would then go off the coast of Miami swimming. He'd go to a ledge meeting during the day. He'd go down onto the beach where he left his pile of clothes at the edge of the beach, and he swam away, but then he swam a few meters down the shore. He went back and found another stash of clothes that he'd hidden. His plan was to go via San Francisco to Hawaii to Australia, but he missed the flight. He missed his connection. And more worrying for him, when he got back to the hotel, nobody had missed him. So he's really successful. So what he did, he went back to London, and he treated it as a test run. And so he said, I'm still going to do it, but I'm going to take somebody with me to the business meeting. So he took a colleague to America, allegedly to raise money to save his businesses that were floundering in England. And he made a point saying, well, I'm going for a swim now. Okay, and I'll see you at 8 o'clock when I've had me swim. And he went down onto the beach, and there was a lady in a kiosk, and he said, I'm going for a swim, and I'm going to leave my clothes here. Then he swam off the shore, and he did the trick that I've said, is he went down the coast, swam ashore, got some clothes hidden, and this time he did make his connecting flight, and he did make it to Australia. The detective in the police that was tasked with the job of looking for him in Florida said, I don't believe this. He said, there's a chance he could have been taken by a shark, but the tide's coming in. He would have been swept ashore. We've not got a body. We think that he's lying. So already the police in Florida think he's missing, but he's reported missing. And in London, we've got one of our MPs missing and believed he's drowned in Florida. Actually, he was in Melbourne alive, as we know. And on occasions, his mistress went out to meet him, or he flew to Europe and had meetings with his mistress. So he was taking a bit of a risk. What he used to get out there, because obviously he can't use his own passport now because John Stonehouse is dead, as far as we've got to believe. He actually used a trick, and I'll talk about it in detail a bit later. It was featured in Day of the Jackal, the film, but it's where you use somebody else's identity to get a passport. And what John Stonehouse did, on the surface doing research, he went to see 2 widows in his constituency to see how they'd been treated following the deaths of their husbands. He got their husbands' details, and he got new passports in their name. So he's got 2 identities of 2 dead men. And the way that the passport system works in England, it doesn't pick up the fact that you're taking out a passport in the name of somebody that's died. And so he'd got 2 names. What he'd also done before he'd gone to Australia, he'd managed to raise a load of money by dubious methods through loans. and he'd sent that out to a bank branch in Melbourne, Australia. Unfortunately for him, the bank clerk thought it was strange that this guy's just walked in and he's drawn a six-figure sum of money out and walked out with it. Said, I don't want it, I'm going to put it into another bank account. And the bank clerk went out on his lunch break and followed him and saw him putting the money back into another bank. And he went into the other bank and found out that it was under another name. Also unlucky for John Stonehouse is that guy, who I've just put up on the screen a little bit earlier, the black and white photograph, is Lord Lucan. He was a member of the British aristocracy that had murdered his children's nanny. He was actually aiming to murder his wife, but he mistook the nanny for his wife in the darkness of the house. The Australian police thought they'd got Lord Lucan because the bank said he was a really well-spoken Englishman, so it's got to be Lord Lucan. But they contacted Scotland Yard and they said it could be John Stonehouse. So they went into the flat that the man had given his address and they found a box of matches for the hotel in Miami that John Stonehouse had been stopping at. So it was actually John Stonehouse that they'd got. So a bit of good work by the police in Melbourne there. They thought they'd got Lord Lucan, but they'd got Stonehouse. He refused to come back to England. He fought extradition, but eventually did manage to come back, or the police got him back. But you think all that shame, he'd immediately resign as being an MP. Well, not John. He decided to stop on as an MP to fight his corner, and he did it quite blatantly. He said, no, I'm not going to retire, I'm going to carry on being an MP. The jury at the Old Bailey had different ideas about that, because when he tried to plead not guilty, they ended up changing the law, because at that time there were three ways a defendant could give evidence or defend himself. One is say nothing, which a lot of defendants do. The other is to go into the witness box and give evidence under oath, but that opens you to cross-examination by the prosecution, when it can make it look a bit silly. At that time, there was a third way, where you just stood up outside the box and gave an unsworn statement, which usually lasted about 30 minutes. His lasted 7 days, as a result of which they changed the law and they stopped people doing that in future. So he was found guilty. He was sent to prison for 7 years. When he came out of prison, no longer an MP, they stopped him being an MP. He made his money by writing books and appearing on TV chat shows, talking about what it's like to go missing. Sadly, on one of those chat shows, at the age of 62, he died in front of the cameras. So that's another way that people have gone. An MP trying to avoid debt, famous person, quite sad in the end that lost his family. He did marry his secretary, Sheila Buckley, but that's John Stonehouse. So another reason for going missing. I was talking about the Great Train Robbery being the biggest robbery of the century. Well, it wasn't, because in 1983, there was a robbery at a secure premises of Brinks Mat at Heathrow Airport, where they stole £26 million worth of gold. The trouble is, it was almost pure gold, 99.9% pure, which they couldn't sell onto the second-hand market. So they then had to smelt it and put old jewellery or old gold coins with it. And the people that they went to do this were the to-go-to handlers in the south of England. The black and white photograph just there, that's a guy called John Palmer. Lad left school, dyslexic, bit of a character. He'd got a successful business buying and smelting second-hand gold. There's that guy at the top there who interested in, Kenneth Noy. I'd come from a reasonable background in Kent, quite a bright lad. He went and trained as being a printer, but he was involved in minor crime. And when he became a good printer, he used his skills to forge documents such as insurance, car insurance, driving licenses. So he's always on the edge of the law. But on the surface, he was a successful businessman. And that's Hollywood Cottage down in Kent where he lived. So on the surface, very, very successful businessman. But it was a nasty piece of work, was our Kenneth. He went on trial twice, and I haven't got time to go into great detail about the Brinks Mat robbery. That does form part of another presentation. Whilst he was being observed by the police, there were 2 undercover police officers in his garden, and they were watching the gold arrive. One night, that officer, John Fordham, detective in the Metropolitan Surveillance Team, but dressed in camouflage, blacked out face, was in the garden of Noy's house when Noy's dogs started to bark, and he went out to see what it was. And he found the detective constable, John Fordham, who he stabbed 10 times, 5 in the chest, 5 in the back. He went on trial for his murder, and his defence was self-defence. I've come out of my house, it's dark, you know I'm a bit of a villain, I'm on the edge and gangs are looking for me, and I see this guy in camouflage clothes with his face black, what would you do? And the jury believed him, and he got found not guilty to murdering the police officer. And at the end of that trial, he stood up and he thanked all the jury, as a gentleman would do, for finding him not guilty. What the jury didn't know, that he was then going to stand trial almost immediately after for handling the gold and for smelting it down. And the jury in that case didn't fall for his smooth talk, and they sentenced him, or he found him guilty. The judge sentenced him to 14 years for the handling the stolen gold. And the guy that only a few weeks before had stood up and thanked the jury for doing their civic duty, stood up and said to the jury, I hope you all die of cancer. And that's the sort of guy that he was, and he went to prison. But it's not that he goes on the run for, because our Kenneth served this time. And he's out one Sunday, going for a Sunday drink with his cronies, when he's involved what we would call a road rage, a dispute with another driver on a junction of the M25 in Kent. And in the other vehicle, that's the Range Rover is Kenneth Noyes, and the van belongs to a lad called Stephen Cameron, who's 21-year-old. In the van with him is his 18-year-old girlfriend, Diane Cable. Kenneth Noyes, bit of a lad. He doesn't like being cut up by the van, so he gets out to take young Stephen Cameron on. Unknown to Kenneth Noyes, Stephen Cameron is also a martial arts expert, and Kenneth Noyes picked on the wrong one. But Kenneth likes to carry a knife, doesn't he? So he stabs 21-year-old Stephen Cameron dead at the side of the motorway and gets in his Range Rover and drives off. He then calls upon the help from his colleagues in the criminal world, and what they do, they destroy his Range Rover, but get an identical one and puts the same number plate on. So when the police come looking for it for forensics, they find a Range Rover that's totally clean. There is no evidence, because it's not the Range Rover used at the time of the murder. Kenneth knows that police are going to be looking for him. He thinks, or he knows that the police, he says, have never forgiven him for the not guilty verdict of killing John Fordham, the detective. So he knows he's got to escape. So, looks a bit older now, but that's John Palmer, that's the other handler of the gold. He didn't get found guilty at court for handling the gold. He got away with it and used it, the illicit gold that he'd got, to become a successful businessman on the surface. He's got a private jet, he's got a helicopter, he's got a house or chateau in France, and actually the following day in the helicopter, he flies Kenneth Noyes to France. And they start to plan is how they're going to hide Kenneth Noyes somewhere in the world so the police can't find him. So it's a fairly big place, the world. So they start off in France. They move him to Tenerife because John Palmer's built a number of apartments in Tenerife. They move him to Spain. They move him to Amsterdam for a short time, and Kenneth Noyes thinks, I bet they don't recognise me. So he goes into the main police station in Amsterdam, where there's a poster with his photograph on behind the counter to report his pedal cycle stolen, to see whether the Dutch police officer will recognise him, and he doesn't. He lives in Amsterdam for a while. He then goes to Africa, and he goes to a state in West Africa, where he lives in an embassy of a European government. We don't know which government it is, but he lived in the compound because he'd had involvement with that government, smuggling gold into their country a few years previously. But eventually, he decides he needs to settle down. So he goes and lives in Cadiz in southern Spain. He actually lives in a house not far from their equivalent of the Home Secretary, his summer house. So he's living near to the Spanish government minister responsible for law and order. It's also near enough to Gibraltar, which is a British protectorate in southern Spain, because he needs his bacon. He says he needs to be near to Gibraltar. He used to go to Gibraltar regularly. He wasn't on what we would call the Costa del Crime. He didn't want to be seen by other criminals. His other attraction, other than money, is women. And although he's constantly on the telephone to his wife, telling her how much he loves her, he has a mistress called Maria. And Maria is a keen horsewoman. She likes to go to show jumping events. And that was his big mistake, because he went to a show jumping event with Maria, and he was seen by a British couple who recognised him. And they went back to England and said, I'm sure we've seen Kenneth Noyes. So the police in Kent, where the murder had took place, had got somewhere to start looking for him. And they did an absolutely amazing job. He said, shouldn't have gone forward there, go back. They did an absolutely amazing job. They knew it was in southern Spain, but they didn't know exactly where. So they sent a team of undercover police officers to Spain, and they sat on road junctions, waiting and watching cars go past, until one day they saw Kenneth Noye in a car. And they followed him, and they found his favourite restaurant in a little town just outside Cadiz. So they took Danielle, Stephen Cameron's girlfriend, and they sat in the back of the restaurant with her until Kenneth Noye came in. And she identified him as being the guy that had murdered her fiancé, had murdered Stephen Cameron. Kenneth Noye, unsurprisingly, fought extradition for 2 years. He came back to England and was convicted of murder and was sent to prison for murder. He's back out now. He's out on the streets. So, but he always said, if you'd have asked me, I'd have come home and pleaded guilty to manslaughter, but I knew I'd have got sentenced because of the bobby I killed, and I got away with it. So that's somebody that tried to escape. It shows a massive and a very effective police operation to get him. I've talked about the passports. I've talked about a couple of people and how they got them. Kenneth Noye had an interesting way of getting his false passport. He managed to find someone in England that was a quadriplegic who would never, ever leave his house, so he wouldn't need a passport. So he gave him £2,000 and said, will you apply for a passport with my photograph? So that's how Kenneth Noye. The other way, as I've said, is you go around a grave, you look for somebody who's died. Probably it's better if it's died as a child or a baby, got a similar date of birth to you or a similar age group. You then apply for the passport. And I call it the day of the jackal method of getting a passport. And that's how a lot of them do it. So let's go on to the next one. We've talked about people escaping for crime, because they're spies, MPs. This is an interesting guy, John Darwin. He'd had a number of jobs, lived in the northeast of England. He wanted to live above his station in life. He'd been a teacher, he'd worked in a bank, he'd worked as a prison officer, but his income didn't match his spending. There's a very nice book and TV programme about it, worth a read if it tempts you by hearing this presentation. But he dabbled in the property market, he bought terraced houses, tried to rent them out. He overspent on his credit cards. That's a Range Rover, modern Range Rover of the time. He went and bought a Range Rover. But the banks were closing in on him, particularly the credit card companies, because he was massively in debt. So he said to his wife, I need to die, I'll take a massive insurance policy out and I'll die and we'll get the money. She goes, well, I don't want you to die. He says, well, I'm not really going to die. I'm going to disappear and then you can claim on the insurance. She said, oh, I'm not going to do that. He says, well, if you don't do it, I will really kill myself. She goes, go on then. So what he does, they've got 2 houses as flats. They own number 3 and number 4. They live in number 3 and number 4's converted into flats. And he's got a canoe, and he goes out in his canoe in the sea's actually opposite that house. And she then drives down the coast and waits for him. And he gets out the canoe and leaves that abandoned. She then takes him to the railway station where he goes off with camping equipment to another part of England where he stops for about 3 weeks. He could have stopped longer, but it was cold and horrible, so he came home and he went and hid in one of the flats in number 4. And then he would come through to number 3, but if anybody came, he would go back into the flat number 4. They actually told their grown-up sons that he was dead. As far as they were concerned, their father was dead. Local people, he grew a beard, he made himself look unkempt, and if it was to go outside the house, she would say it was the handyman that was doing repairs, and he was actually walking around his hometown at the time, Seaton Crewe in northeast of England, but he was reported as a missing person. But actually they got an idea that let's go to Panama, shall we? And let's buy some property in Panama. There's no extradition agreement with Panama, and we'll disappear out there. So John had to do the Day of the Jackal and get a passport in another name, so he did that. Went to the cemetery, got the details, and they went out to Panama. But how it all ended? Well, about 5 years after he disappeared, one Saturday tea time, there was that's West End Central Metropolitan Police Station. A guy came in, and the sergeant who was about to go off duty and take his wife out for a meal suddenly found out he wasn't going out for a meal because a guy came in and said, I'm dead, or people think I'm dead, but I've lost my memory and I've been missing. And he'd come back to England, and I'll explain why he came back to England in a second, and gave himself up at a police station as being this poor guy that's had amnesia for 5 years, and said, I think my name's John Darwin, I think I'm from north of England. So the cops there had to ring his sons and say, we found your dad, you know, and the two guys, you remember these two lads, they'd since married. One of them had actually delayed his wedding when his dad disappeared. My dad's not dead, he's alive. Well, you know, he's had amnesia, you know, thank goodness he wasn't dead. Well, actually, one of their downfalls is they actually bought an apartment in Panama, and they agreed to go on the estate agent's website photographs. So that's them in Panama when he's supposed to be dead. But they carried on living in Panama, and then the Panama government said, we're a bit concerned about all these fugitives living here, but you can carry on living here if you can get a letter from the chief constable or chief of police for your area to say that you're a good egg. Well, of course, John couldn't get a letter to say he was a good egg because he was dead. So he couldn't get the letter. So that's why he came back to England and had to admit that he was alive, that he wasn't missing. His wife stopped in Panama, but Anne was quickly tracked down by national newspapers, and she came back to England as well. And actually, the jury at Teesside Crown Court didn't think he was missing and died. They thought he was a fraudster that had tried to claim massive amounts of money from insurance companies. John thought if he gave the money back to the insurance company, it'd all be all right. Well, he obviously didn't understand the law, did he? And he went to prison. But then when he came out of prison, he went to the Philippines, and that's his new bride. He left his wife in England, who'd stood by him. They got 6 years apiece. She actually got 6 years and 6 months because the judge saw her crime as worse than his by lying to the sons. So that's John Darwin. The ones sort of fairly light-hearted, the ones that I've talked about so far in one sense. The serious criminals, but at the end of it, they've been caught, and it's generally been about money. I did say that some people go on the run to escape custody. And this job goes back to when I hadn't been a cop for more than a couple of years. And it occurs in the county of Derbyshire, which is just below, just on the edge of where I worked, near to a town called Chesterfield, and it's on the moors. I remember it quite vividly, because at the time, I was a single lad, I'd got a girlfriend who was a policewoman, and her mum and dad lived near to where this occurred. And I'll come to something in a minute, I'll explain, is particularly for the policewoman's mum, it's particularly poignant. So we've got, that's Thomas William Hughes. He's a roughneck, a real nasty piece of work, and he was brought up in the west coast town of Blackpool. He was married, got a couple of kids, but he met a young woman from Chesterfield who was working in Blackpool for the summer, and he fell in love with her, and he just abandoned his wife and kids, and when she went back to Chesterfield to live, he followed her to Chesterfield, and they became a couple. But a really vicious man. One night he went to a nightclub, his girlfriend was at home, he saw her, it was a summer's evening, he saw a young girl that he liked, she left the nightclub with a boyfriend, he followed them to a park, Queen's Park in Chesterfield, and they were taking a shortcut through the park. He viciously attacked her boyfriend, seriously assaulted him, and then he viciously raped the girl. So that's the sort of guy that he is. Very, very easy to recognise. The description they gave, very quickly people in the town, and actually his girlfriend realised he was the one. He was arrested and he was remanded in custody to Leicester Prison. But the process at that time, it doesn't happen now, is every week or a fortnight they would have to be brought, the prisoner would have to be brought back to the court in England to appear and for the hearing to decide whether they could stop in custody or not. So it was now January 1977. The offence, the rape, had occurred in 1976. It was due to go to the Magistrates' Court in Chesterfield. There was a lot of snow about. Because of the offence he committed, he should have gone in a secure van, something like that. And he should have wore shackles like that. But there was no van available, and all the shackles had been used. And despite the protests of the two prison officers that were going to escort him, they said, well, you're going to have to go in a taxi like that. And that's the actual vehicle that they went in. So instead of the secure prison van, and instead of the shackles, he went with normal handcuffs in, sat in the back of that taxi with his handcuffs on. One prison officer sat in the front at the side of the driver, another prison officer sat in the back. Also at the prison, they'd allowed him to work in the prison kitchen. So what he'd done while I was in the kitchen, he'd stolen a knife that had not been noticed it was missing. He'd hidden it in his mattress. And on this particular day, he was going to cook because he was intending to escape. He'd hidden the knife down the front of his trousers. When he was searched, and there was no electronic wands then, it was down to a pat-down search, they didn't find the knife. So he's in the back of that taxi, he's got a knife down in his groin, and he's got simple handcuffs on. En route to Chesterfield, to the court, he says to the prison officers, I've got a dicky tummy, and if you don't take me to the toilet soon, I'm going to make a mess in this car. And they said, we can't, we're nearly at the court. He says, no, I need to go to the toilet. And the taxi driver said, if he makes a mess in my car, there's a fee to pay for get the car cleaned. So they agreed to pull off the M1 motorway, the freeway, Travel Services, which is just south of Chesterfield. And that's where he escapes, because the prison officers, being a bit cute, when they go to the toilets, they go and check the cubicle to make sure there's no weapons hidden in the system, thinking he's got this right. So he says, look, it's not going to be pleasant, this. So they take the handcuffs off and they close the toilet cubicle door, where he retrieves the knife and he puts it up his cuff this time. And so he gets back in the car, and shortly after they come off the motorway to travel towards Chesterfield, he pulls the knife out and he stabs both prison officers in the neck. They're very, very seriously injured. And he then holds the knife to the driver's throat. He says, get up onto the moors. They drive around Chesterfield. This part of the plan isn't too good because he doesn't know what to do now. He actually wants to go and see his girlfriend, but he thinks, well, I better not go there. And he gets them to drive up onto the moors. There's a lot of very barren countryside around there. He drives up onto the moors. He kicks the very badly injured prison officers out and the driver, and he sets off driving, and he doesn't get very far before he crashes the car and he abandons it. And he's walking across the moors in really, really bad weather, snow, ice, until he comes to Pottery Cottage. And that's a converted farmhouse that two families have converted to two homes. There's Amy and Arthur in the 70s. They've got part of the cottage, their half. Their daughter Gillian and Richard, her husband Richard, and their little daughter Sarah, she's the granddaughter. They've made it into two homes with an adjoining door. He turns up there. Arthur and Amy are in. Arthur tries to fight his corner and he's assaulted, and he's tied up in the living room. And until the rest of the family come home, it's Amy there in the 70s looking after him. Then Gillian comes home. Then Sarah, the little girl at 10, comes home, and that's when my girlfriend at the time, her mum was on the bus and saw her go down the drive to the farm, quite isolated. Richard comes home. He's now got 4 adults and a child, and he holds them hostage. Within a few hours, he murders Arthur in one of the rooms. He keeps them separate so they don't know who's alive and who's dead. And for some unknown reason, he murders Sarah, the 10-year-old girl. But he tells Gillian and Richard and Amy that they're still alive, and he takes meals into them at regular intervals and brings empty plates back, making them think that he's alive. He actually gets Gillian and Richard to take him out to go and get money, to do a recce of how he's going to escape. All the time, he's 2 dead people in the cottage, and they think, are they dead? He's saying they're not dead, we'll trust him. He then repeatedly rapes Gillian, and then it comes to the night that he's going to escape. He has some trial runs, and he's going to escape, and Gillian's going to get Gillian to drive him away. And he said, I need to nip back into the house. And he nips back into the house, and he murders a husband and a mum. So he's now murdered everybody except Gillian. Her car won't start on the drive, and she shouts for assistance from a neighbour. He's panicking now because he wants to get away. And she manages to get a surreptitious message to the neighbour, this is the guy they're looking for. Because it's on TV that he's wanted, they're searching. But the search parameters don't come as far as their cottage. They think he's gone to Lancashire. The actual search parameters were 200 metres short of their cottage. That's why it wasn't searched. So he goes on the run. And they did get him. And he's followed by an unmarked CID car that they see detectives in a car, 3 of them. And he sees they're behind him, and he stops and he holds a knife to Gillian's throat. And he says, right, I want your car. And the detectives are faced with, they're not armed, because generally police officers in England aren't armed. They give him the keys to the police car. and he drives off in the police car. There then becomes a chase. You see the snow on the road there, across the hills, and people who know England, Derbyshire, on a snowy night is not the place to be chasing. There's a convoy of police cars chasing him. And by this time, he gets into Staffordshire, an adjoining county. I'm not sure they'd do it today in England because of human rights, but a smart-thinking cop gets a bus driver to put a bus across the road. And Gillian, who's driving the car, swerves and hits a wall. And then there's a standoff for about an hour where Hughes is holding a knife and an axe to her. A chief inspector from Buxton Police Station, quite a small police station, goes and tries to negotiate, and they think that it's going to work, that he's going to give himself up. They don't know that all the family's dead. They think they've just got a kidnap at this time. They don't realise they've got a multiple murder. And just when they think they've won him over, he starts to attack Gillian in the car. Thankfully, by this time, and we hadn't got in those days permanently armed officers, 2 officers had managed to get to a police station and draw 2 firearms, and they managed to and they shot him dead in the car. Then, obviously, Gillian was taken to hospital, and then she had to have the awful news broken to her that all her family were dead. I don't know how she managed, but she did manage, and that's Gillian there, obviously stood with her parents and her late husband and her daughter. And after a few years, she did get married again, and she had a little girl, so she did recover from it. But I can only imagine how awful that must be. She did ask after about a month if she could meet the police officers that had rescued her and to say thank you to them. And, you know, a really, really dreadful crime. So although the first few cases have been light-hearted, when people go missing, they will do absolutely anything to stop free. And that's probably quite an extreme one, but it is one that shows what criminals will do to escape. But could you do it today? Well, I think you'd struggle to go on the run today. With facial recognition cameras, you need credit cards, social media, mobile phones. I would say it's almost impossible to go on the run today. For normal people, I'm not saying that super-duper spies might not be able to, but I think it's quite difficult to go on the run. Facial recognition is getting better and better all the time. And I always felt this, going back to being a cop, assisting offenders, if you help them hide, it's a criminal offence. And I have been to houses where people have been in a false bottom in the settee and have actually sat on the settee where they're in it. A lot of them always go in the wardrobe or they go in the loft. Can I tell you, they're the places that the police search the first, the loft and the wardrobe. And I've had people seriously in the wardrobe. So if you're going on the run, probably now's a good time to do it as the cruise comes to an end. And we can all go on the run together from tomorrow, those that are getting off in Tokyo. Ladies and gents, you've been a fantastic audience for the presentation that I've given. Thanks very much. And thank you to the staff up in the box at the back. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.